Hey Chevra, what's happening? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Pei Beis, Daf 82 of Masechta Ayruvin. The Daf begins with a continuation of yesterday's Daf about where Rabbi Yehuda is arguing versus explaining the opinion of the rabbis, and that leads to an interesting discussion about gambling. A somewhat famous only because it's just an interesting topic, I think, about the perspective of towards gambling and why people who gamble are unfit to testify. We conclude the 7th parak of Masechta Ayruvin. We begin the 8th parak. We talk about a child who by default will or will not be included in the ayruv made by his mother. And at the end of the daf, we talk about amounts, sizes for ayruv tchumen. We've been talking about ayruv tchumen for quite a while. So how much food do you have to include in an ayruv tchumen? Can anybody tell me? It's come up in the past. The answer is mazon shtei sudis. We're going to get into a little bit of detail of that. Chevre, we are beginning on the second line of Daf Pei Beis. Gufa, we said earlier, that being yesterday. Amar Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, says Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, Kol makom she'amar Rabbi Yehuda, whenever Rabbi Yehuda says, E masai uvameh b'mishnaseinu, any time in Mishnayos where Rabbi Yehuda says, E masai or bameh dvar mamurim, enu el lefarish divrei chachamim, he's not coming to argue on the rabbis, he's coming to explain the rabbis. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Rabbi Yochanan has a slightly different opinion, E masai lefarish uvameh lachlok. So Rabbi Yochanan says that whenever Rabbi Yehuda says Amosai, so then that's explaining the Chachamim's opinion. But if he says Bameh, such as in our Mishnah, Bameh Dvar Mamurim, so then he's actually coming to argue on the opinion of the rabbis. And I guess you can maybe say that Shmuel agrees with Rabbi Yochanan, right? Shmuel who says that Rabbi Yehuda argues on the rabbis and that we paskin like Rabbi Yehuda. So maybe Shmuel holds like Rabbi Yochanan's view, which is that Amosai is coming to explain. But when Rabbi Yehuda says Bameh Dvar Mamurim, he would be arguing. Akopanim, it's machlokas between Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi and Rabbi Yochanan. The Amosai, the Farish, one second. Now, interestingly, both according to Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi and according to Rabbi Yochanan, Amosai is to explain, right? The machlokas between them was about what about Bameh Dvar Mamurim, but everybody agrees that Amosai is to explain. But the Gemara says, wait a second, Amosai, the Farish, is Amosai really to explain? Who? V'atanan, but we learn in a Mishnah. Ve'elu ein apsulim, the following fellows are unfit to give testimony. They are pasul la'edus. Hamasachik b'kuvya, a gambler, somebody who plays with dice. Umalva b'ribis, somebody who lends money with interest. Umafriche yonim, somebody who does pigeon racing, also a form of gambling. V'sochre shvius, people who do business with shmita produce that is supposed to be left out for people to take, and this fellow instead sells it for a profit. So these are people who are unfit to give testimony. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, to which Rabbi Yehuda says, "A Masai, when do we say this? That they are unfit to give testimony? Bizman she'en lo umnus elahi. Only if they are full-time gamblers. If they gamble all the time, that is their main source of income, well then they are unfit to give testimony. Aval yesh lo umnus shelohi. But if they have a day job and on the side they enjoy gambling, harezeh kosher, then he is allowed to testify. And in a few minutes we will discuss what exactly is the issue with gambling that would cause somebody to be unfit to testify. Vitani Allah b'braisa, and we learn in a braisa, v'chachamim omrim, and the chachamim say, bein she'ein lo umnus elahi, uvein she'esh lo umnus sheloi. Harezeh pasul. And we learn in a braisa that according to the rabbi's opinion, it doesn't matter if there's no nafkamina if it's his full-time job or if it's his part-time job. Either way, he would be unfit to give testimony. So here we see that we have this opinion of the rabbis, and we're assuming that the opinion of the rabbis is the same opinion as the opinion of the Tanna Kama that Rabbi Yehuda is arguing on, and the rabbis seem to be saying that somebody who gambles is unfit to give testimony, and that's whether this is his full-time profession, whether he does this as a side thing. makes no difference. He's pasul edus, and Rabbi Yehuda seems to be saying Amosai, when is this? Yet he seems to be arguing and saying that it's only if he does it full time. But if he's a part-time gambler, so he would be allowed to give testimony. So here's an example of Rabbi Yehuda saying Amosai, and yet he seems to be arguing. So how could it be that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi and Rabbi Yochanan both agree that whenever Rabbi Yehuda says Amosai, it's only explaining? This seems to be an example of Amosai that's arguing. So the Gemara answers Ahi. Now it's a little bit confusing because we're saying Ahi Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Tarfon. It's actually not referring to Rabbi Yehuda. It's talking about the Chachamim. That the opinion of the Chachamim that no matter, right, that a gambler, whether it's full-time or part-time, is going to be pasul le'edos, is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Rabbi Tarfon. The Tanya, as we learn in the Brayso, Rabbi Yehuda mishum Rabbi Tarfon, L'olam ein echad men nazir lefisha naziris el la'afla. This is talking about when you have two fellas, let's call them Reuven and Shimon. They're sitting and they're drinking beer, having a nice time, Erev Shabbos, whatever it might be. I made up the beer part in the Erev Shabbos, but you have, and also that their names Reuven and Shimon. So I made up most of it. But Lamaisa, let's just say in our example, their name is Reuven and Shimon, and they see Levi walking by, and Reuven says, if Levi is a Nazir, I'm a Nazir. Shimon says, if Levi isn't a Nazir, I'm a Nazir. So, on the one hand, you would say, well, it's kind of black and white. Levi is either a Nazir or not a Nazir, and therefore one of them is going to be, therefore either Shimon or Levi is going to be a Nazir, right? One of them said, either Reuven or Shimon is going to be a Nazir, because one of them said, if Levi is a Nazir, I'm a Nazir. If he said, the other one says, if he isn't a Nazir, then I'm a Nazir. So, one of them's got to be a Nazir. So, says Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Rabbi Tarfon, actually neither one of them is a Nazir. Huh? Why? Because being a Nazir has to be explicit. Neither Reuven nor Shimon were explicit. They said, look, if Levi's a Nazir, or if he isn't a Nazir, I'm a Nazir. But it didn't explicitly say, I am going to be a Nazir. So the Alma, what do we see? Kevin de Mesapgale I Nazir, I lo Nazir, who lo meshabed nafshe, and that's the key, right? That since it was besuffic, it was unclear whether Levi was a Nazir or not. So Reuven and Shimon, when they made their stipulations, were not meshabed. They didn't oblige themselves to their stipulation. They didn't say it wholeheartedly. They didn't really mean it, since there was a doubt as to Levi, whether Levi was actually a Nazir or not. So Hachanami here also, in the context of gambling, since a person who's gambling doesn't know if he's going to win or not, so he doesn't really give his money wholeheartavely. Meaning the idea, so here now, and these are the two perspectives when it comes to gambling, right? What's the svara? What's the rationale between the machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rabbi Tarfon? Rabbi Yehuda, who says that only if it's a full-time profession is he pasul le'edos, but if it's part-time it's okay. Whereas Rabbi Tarfon says no matter what it's a problem. So, because Rabbi Yehuda, let's start with Rabbi Tarfon. So, Rabbi Tarfon's opinion, the opinion that whether it's full-time or part-time makes no difference, it's because it's a type of theft, right? And therefore, whether you're a part-time thief or a full-time thief, you're a thief and you're pasul le'edos. Why is it theft? It's theft because the assumption being that if a person knew that he was going to lose, he wouldn't just give away his money. He's putting down his money because he's assuming, for whatever reason, that he's going to win. And therefore, when he doesn't win, so he doesn't really want to be giving his money. He's only giving it because he's forced to, and therefore it's a type of theft because whoever's taking the money is taking money from somebody who doesn't really want to give it to him. So therefore, according to Tarfon, all gamblers are thieves because it's all because you're basically taking somebody's money from them against their will. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda's opinion is that no, you're not a thief. However, there's a question of she'eno also be yeshuva, right? She'en oskin be asukin be yeshuva shel olam, that they're not involved in the ways of the world, right? And that's the nafkamina between full-time versus part-time. Somebody who's got a day job and they enjoy gambling, on the side. So beseder, what's the big deal? They enjoy gambling. However, if it's a full-time gig, that means that they're not involved in the world. They don't understand what it means to work hard to make a living. They just want to make a quick buck, right? They just want to kind of like hang out as much as they can, and then when they need money, they're just going to try some kind of scheme, some kind of game. They're just going to put a bet on something and hope they can make fast, quick money and survive that way, which is not sort of the general way that the world works, which is that, people have to do all sorts of different things in order to make money and sustain themselves. And because they're disconnected from the way that the world works, they're unable to testify in a court that establishes the rule of law for society. Anyways, those are the two different perspectives as to why a gambler is forbidden, is not allowed to testify. Pretty interesting, right? Right. Hadron alach chalon. So we will come back to Perek Chalon. Chevra, this is unbelievable how much ground we are covering. We're up to the 8th parak of Masechta Ayruvin already. 8 out of 10. We're getting remarkably close, Chevra. You can feel it. You can mamish feel it, Lemaise. New parak, Ketzad Mishtatvim B'Tchumen. How do you join people in Eruv Tchumen? Okay? So, up until now, we've been talking about Eruv Tchumen already for the past 2 months already. But we've always been talking about Eruv Tchumen in like a very manual way, right? You take a can of tuna fish, you put it out 2,000 amas away. It's always been talking about one person. Maybe you can send a shliach to do it for you. What about, can you make an Eruv Tchumen for the whole city? So how do you join lots of people in Eruv Tchumen? Maniach es hachavis. So you take a barrel and you put it 2,000 amas away. But when you say areze l'chol b'nei iri, this is for my entire city. Anybody who's going to the mourner's house, or l'veis hamishta, or to the opposite, the place where there's a feast going on. Anybody who needs to walk 2,000 amas, an additional 2,000 amas tomorrow, can be included in this Eruv. Anybody who accepted upon themselves during the daytime that they are planning to rely on this Eruv, well then they can be included in the Eruv. But if they only decide once Shabbos begins that they want to rely on this Eruv, well then it's not allowed. Because you cannot make an Eruv once Shabbos already begins. Amar Rav Yosef says, Rav Yosef ein ma'arvin ela l'dvar mitzvah. Says Rav Yosef that you're allowed to make an Eruv Tchumen only for the sake of a mitzvah. My kamash malan tanina. What's the big chiddush of Rav Yosef? We already learned it in our Mishnah. That we're talking about making an Eruv Tchumen for somebody who's going to a mourner's house or to a place of a feast, of a Sudas Mitzvah, I guess. So we see already that Eruv Tchumen is specifically for mitzvahs. So ma'udetema, I may have thought to say, Orcha de Milsa Katani. Maybe I would say that the Mishnah isn't specifically saying that it needs to be a Dvar Mitzvah, just these are examples of things that you might want to make an Eruv for, such as Beis HaEvel or Beis HaMishteh. So Kamash Malon, where Yosef is teaching us that no, these are explicit. It's specifically a Beis HaEvel or a Beis HaMishteh, a place that's a mitzvah. And anybody who accepted the Eruv before Shabbos. So Shmazmina ein breira. Remember the sugya of breira, of Photoshop? Right, so we want to say, let's bring a proof from our Mishnah that it's saying that you dafka have to join in the Eruv from before Shabbos, you can't join in the Eruv after Shabbos. Well, why don't we say Breira? Why don't we say Photoshop? Why don't we say that you can decide on Shabbos whether or not you want to rely on the Eruv Tchumen, and when you decide on Shabbos, I want to rely on the Eruv Tchumen, so then we'll go back in time, and it'll be Ki'ilu before Shabbos already, that was your intention. From the fact that we're saying that you have to make the decision before Shabbos, that means that you can't say Breira. So again, Shmas Mina, so let's learn from our Mishnah, Ein Breira, the Yesh Breira, because if you could say Breira, Tigali Milsan Mafreya, well then, you should be able to say retroactively, Demi Ba'od Yom, Havanichale, that this is what he wanted before Shabbos began, right? If we say Breira, so let him decide on Shabbos that he wants to rely on the Eruv, and then that will retroactively be as though his intention before Shabbos was to rely on the Eruv Tchumen. Rav Ashi, Hodi'u v'lo di'u katani, says Rav Ashi, you have to read the Mishnah a little bit differently. It's not talking about he decided before Shabbos or he decided on Shabbos. No, that's not the inyan. The inyan is, did he know about it before Shabbos or not? If he didn't know about it before Shabbos, well then, forget it, it's not going to work because, he B'chlal didn't know that there was an Eruv there. Even you can't just decide on Shabbos that he's going to rely on this ayruv that he didn't even know existed before Shabbos, because you can't say brera that before Shabbos his intention was to rely on it. He didn't even know it existed. But if he knew it existed before Shabbos, well then it's acceptable, even if he didn't yet decide that he wanted to rely on the ayruv. That can be done on Shabbos because we can say brera. So it's not a proof, according to Rav Ashi, it's not a proof about either way for brera, because you can say you could still say if he did know about it before Shabbos, he could stay brera and rely on the ayruv. The not relying on the ayruv thing is only if he didn't even know bichlal that it existed before Shabbos. Very, very gorgeous. Okay, Chavre, we are now up to the sugya of a child being included by default in his mother's ayruv. Amar Rav Asi, Ka'in ben Sheish yotze be'ayruv imo. Says Rav Asi that a child who is 6 years old can still be included by default in his mother's ayruv. So if his mother makes an ayruv tchumen because she wants to travel somewhere the next day on Shabbos, so even if she doesn't explicitly include him in the ayruv, by default this child is included in the ayruv because, right, as Rashi says, that child is kigufa, the child is like her body, she's not going to go anywhere without the child. So even a 6-year-old child by default is included in his mother's ayruv. Meisvei, however, we have a kasha. What's the kasha in Rav Asi? Ka'in shetzarich le'imo, a child that needs his mother, yotze be'eruv imo, can be included by default in his mother's eruv. V'she'ein tzarich le'imo, and if the child does not need his mother, in yotze be'eruv imo, well then he's no longer going to be included by default in his mother's eruv. V'tnan nami gabi sukkah, and we say something similar by sukkah, ki'ai gavna, in the similar vein. Ka'in she'ein tzarich le'imo, if you have a child who does not need his mother, well then chayiv b'sukkah, he's chayiv in sukkah. Ve'avinan ba, okay, and we ask, ve'ezu katan she'ein tzarich le'imo, who qualifies as a child that no longer needs his mother? Amid ve'Rab Yanai, I say by the Besmedrsh of Rab Yanai, kol shenifne ve'enimo mekanchaso, any child who can go to the bathroom and does not need his mother to clean him, well then he is no longer considered tzarich le'imo. Reb Shimon ben Lakish Amar says, Rish Lakish, Kol shener mishnaso ve'eno kare ima. Any child that wakes up in the middle of the night and doesn't call out ima. Wait a second, ima sakadaitech? You really think that that's the definition of somebody who doesn't need his mother? Gedolim nami karu. Even children that are big might still wake up in the middle of the night and call out ima. So ella ima, rather I will say, Kol shener mishnaso ve'eno kare ima. No, rather it means a child who doesn't wake up in the middle of the night and not stop calling for his mother, right? So calling for the mother once doesn't necessarily mean it's tzarich le'imo, but twice, kilu more, then it's still well. I meant tzarich le'imo. Basically, if a kid wakes up in the middle of the night and calls for the mother and doesn't stop, so then it's tzarich le'imo. But if that's not the case, then it's considered eno tzarich le'imo. V'chama, okay, let's get objective over here. Well, somewhat objective, I guess. Kivar arba, kivar chamish. 4 or 5. Okay, fine. Beseder. No. So, what's the deal? So, on the one hand, we have Rav Asi, who's saying that a child who's 6 years old is by default included in his mother's eruv. But we also have these brises that make this distinction between needing the mother and not needing the mother. Then we have Rish Lakish and Rab Yana, who are Amorayim, but they're basically saying that a child who's 4 or 5 is already considered doesn't need his mother. And if he doesn't need his mother, well then we have the Bryce who says that if you don't need your mother, then you're not included in the eruv. So on the one hand we have Rav Asi saying that when a child is 6, he's included by default in his mother's eruv. But then we have Rish Lakish and Rab Yana who are saying that already by 4 or 5, the kid is considered not tzarich, right, eno tzarich le'imo, and therefore would not be included in the eruv by default. So is it 6? Is it 4? Is it 5? What's the dealio? So Amar Rav Yoshua bre de Rav Idi, says Rav Yoshua bre de Rav Idi, Kika Amar Rav Asi. So when Rav Asi says that this child who's 6 years old is still included in his mother's eruv, that's talking about Kigon she'eruv olav aviv litzafin v'imo l'darim. It is talking about where his father made an eruv in the north of the city, his mother made an eruv in the south of the city. Tafilu b'shesh nami b'tzavsa de'imei nichale, that even if the kid is 6 years old, he would prefer to be with his mother, in the company of his mother, than his father. So, what Rav Yoshua Breder of Edi wants to say that if the kid's already 5 years old, as explained by Rashi, if the kid's already 5 years old, then he would no longer by default be included in his mother's Eruv. His mother would have to include him in his mother's Eruv. What Ravasi is saying is that in a situation where the kid's father made an Ayruvin, let's say in the north of the city, or not say, let's say, I mean it says explicitly, right? If the father made an Ayruvin in the north of the city, and the mother made an Ayruvin in the south of the city, and they both included the child in the Ayruvs. So now the question is he now that, so they both, it's not a default anymore, right? They both had intention for the child, but which one does the child go by, since there's two options? So if the child is 6 years old, we can assume that he'd still prefer to be in the presence of his mother rather than his father, and we'll go after the Ayruv of the mother. But if we're talking about defaults, so says Rav Yoshua Breder of Edi that Ravasi would say that the default ends at 5, right? By 5 already you need explicit intention. What Ravasi is saying is that once he's 6, so then if both parents made an Ayruv, he would still go based on the mother's Ayruv. Meisvei, however, we have a kasha. If you have a child who needs his mother, Yotze be'eruv imo, so then he's included by default in his mother's Eruv. V'chama, to what age? Ad ben sheish, until 6. So even if you say, ad velo ad b'chla, right? Even if you say mamish until 6, but until 6, he's by default included in his mother's Eruv, which means that when he's 5 years old, he's by default included in his mother's Eruv. Tiyuvta de Rav Yoshua bar Rav Edi tiyuvta, that is a kasha on Rav Yoshua bar Rav Edi, who said that at 5 years old, the mother already would have to explicitly include the child. Yet we have a brisa that is saying, that was a car, that only once the child hits 6, or maybe even including 6, meaning we have this brisa that's saying that certainly, at the age of 5, the child will be included by default in the mother's Eruv, and therefore it's kasha on Rav Yoshua Breder of Edi. Let's say it's also kasha on Ravasi, because Ravasi said that when the kid is 6, he's still included by default in the mother's Eruv. Meaning, Rav Yoshua Breder of Edi wanted to say that it was a whole shtickle Torah when the father made the Eruv in the north, the mother made the Eruv in the south, but we basically just threw out Rav Yoshua Breder of Edi by saying that Rav Yoshua Breder of Edi said that at 5 years old, the mother would explicitly have to have intention for the child, but the brisa throws that out. So we're done with Rav Yoshua Breder of Edi. So now, going back then to Rav Asi, who said that at 6 years old, the child by default is included in the mother's Eruv, but this brisa said until 6 years old. So Rav Asi will say, no, when it says until, it's ad v'ad b'chlal, if you remember from Gemara Brachas. So ad is included, meaning ad sheish is included, 6 is included. So therefore Rav Asi is going to say, just like the brisa, that even when a kid is 6 years old, he can be included in the mother's Eruv. Let's say it's a kasha in Rabbi Yana and Rish Lakish, because they said 4 or 5. Yet this is saying, certainly at least up until 6, the child would be included in the mother's Eruv. So lo kasha de ise avui b'mata had de lo ise avui b'mata. So they will respond that, well, it depends if the father is around. Meaning, if the father is around, well, then already at 4 or 5, the kid would not be included by default in the mother's Eruv, because the father's around, and you could just assume that the child will be with the father. But if the father is not around, well, then it's up to 6. That is how Rish Lakish and Rabbi Yana would make the distinction. Alright, very nice. Tana Rabbanon, the rabbis taught in the Brisa, Ma'av Adam al yidei b'no uvito aktanim. A person can make an Eruv on account or on behalf of his young children, and on behalf of his servants who are not Jewish, whether with their consent or not. But the master of the house cannot make an Eruv for his servants that are Jewish, and not for his older children, and not for his wife, except with their consent. Tani Idach, and we have another brisa that says, a person cannot make an Eruv on behalf of his older children, and not for his Jewish servants, and not for his wife, except with their consent. Aval, but he can make an Eruv for his servants who are not Jewish, and for his young children, whether it's with their consent or not, because their hand is like his hand, right? He has, I guess, more of a control over them, so therefore you can include them in the Eruv even without their consent. V'chulan she'ervu ve'eriv aleim rabban yotzim b'shal rabban chutz min ha'isha mipnei sheichol limchos. Again, v'chulan, and all of the people that we listed above, she'ervu, that if they made their own Eruv, ve'eriv aleim rabban, and the master of the house also made his own Eruv, yotzim b'shal rabban, they will be included in the master of the house's Eruv. Chutz min ha'isha, the exception being the wife, mipnei sheichol limchos, because she can just say, no, I'm not interested in being in your Eruv, husband. So, Isha mai shna, to which the Gemara says, wait, what's so special about the wife? Meaning she was just one of a number of people who would need specific intent, such as older children, such as servants who are Jewish. So, Amar Rabba Isha v'chol dedamila, says Rabba, it means that the wife and anybody similar to her, such as the older children and the servants who are Jewish, right? So if the the master of the house made an Eruv somewhere, and they, the wife or the older children or the Jewish servants made their own Eruvs, well then, they can rely on their own Eruvs. Amar Mar, we said earlier, chutz min ha'isha mipnei sheichol limchos, right? The exception, right? We said that everybody would be included in the master of the house's Eruv, except for the wife when she makes her own Eruv, because she can protest. She could say, look, I'm not interested in your Eruv. Time of the machi, hastama nafka b'debaila, but that would only be if she is explicitly protests. But if she doesn't say anything, so we can assume that by default she'll be included in her husband's Eruv. Hakatani reisha elamidaitam. But one second, but I thought we had said at the beginning of the brayso that davka, you can only be ma'ariv for, let's say, a person can only be ma'ariv for his wife if she has explicit intent. Yet we also seem to be saying that if she, only if she protests would she not be included, but by default she would be included. So what is it? So my lab, the ka'amre ein, my lab, the amre ein. It must be that Elamidaita, my lab, the Amri in. What does it mean with their intent? Meaning they have to explicitly say that they're interested in joining the Eruv, but by default they would not be included in the Eruv. Lo, my Elamidaitam the ishtiku. No, what does it mean with their consent? Meaning that they didn't protest, right? So if they protest, so then they won't be included in the Eruv, but by default they are included in the Eruv. When we say midaitam, that they have to have consent, it means as long as they don't protest, so then that's considered consent, right? But by default they can be included in the Eruv that's being done for the house. Lafuke heicha da amre lo, to the exclusion of where they explicitly say that they're not interested in being part of the Eruv. But one second, havuchulan she'eruv ve'eruv lein rabban. But one second, we said that all of these people mentioned, if they made their own Eruv and the master of the house made his own Eruv, yotzin b'shal rabban, they are included in their master's Eruv. The stama hu, that's a situation of stam. By default they're included. Vikatani, it says chutz min ha'isha, with the exception of the wife, de lo nafke, right, that she's not included. And even though that's not like, she's not specifically saying that she's not intending to be included, right, she makes her own Eruv and now she's not included. So Amarava came and she'ervu ein lach michui gadol mizeh, right? So says Rava, yeah, but since these the wife, and we said anybody similar to her, such as the older children, since they made their own Eruv, it's obvious that they're not interested in being in the father's Eruv. So in that case, it's not really a default situation. So what do we see? So we see basically a a man's wife or his older children or the Jewish servants in the house. So they are kind of have more choice when it comes to Ayruv. So by default, if they don't say anything, so then they can be included in the Ayruv that's being done by the master of the house for everybody. Now, if they say that they're not interested, or if they make their own Ayruv that demonstrates that they're not interested in being part of the other Ayruv, well then they don't have to be part of the other Ayruv. Alright, new Mishnah. Kamu shi'uro. So what is the shi'ur? What is the amount that you need for an Eruv Tchumin? Mazon shtei sudis l'chol echad ve'echad. The answer is enough food for 2 meals for every single person, right? So as opposed to Eruv Chatzeris, which gets capped at 2 meals total, Eruv Tchumin, you would have to have enough for 2 meals for each and every person. Mezon l'chol v'lo l'Shabbos divrei Reb Meir. Reb Meir says that we're talking about weekday meals, not Shabbos meals. Okay, let's go weiter. Rabbi Yehuda omer l'Shabbos v'lo l'chol. Rabbi Yehuda says we're actually talking about Shabbos meals and not weekday meals. Now both Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir are intending to be lenient, meaning Rabbi Meir assumes that during the week you eat less than you do on Shabbos at a typical meal, so therefore we're talking about weekday meals. Rabbi Yehuda says, interestingly, that since on Shabbos you're going to be eating 3 meals, so you pace yourself more and you eat less at each meal. So we're talking about about Shabbos meals for your Erev because they're smaller. So both Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir are saying that the Mazon Shtei Sudis is kilu smaller Sudis. Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka Omer, says Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, mikikar bepundion midalad soin besela. When you can buy a kikar for a pundion and 4 sa'ah for a sela. Now, this gets a little bit technical, but it's going to be kind of important that you get this for the Gemara. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka is saying that Mazon Shtei Sudas is basically a loaf of bread. When you buy a loaf of bread for a pundion, when you buy a loaf of bread for 1 pundion coin, so then that is Mazon Shtei Sudas. When with one sela you can get 4 sa'ah. Now 1 sela is 48 pundion. Now 4 sa'ah is 24 kav. So that means that 48 pundion is 24 kav, which means that 48 pundion, that 1 pundion, or you could say that 48 pundion is 48 half kavs, right? If 48 pundion will buy you 24 kavs, well then 48 pundion is also going to get you 48 half kavs, which means that 1 pundion will get you half of a kav, right? Which means that we're saying that with 1 pundion you can buy 1 loaf of bread. We're also saying that 1 pundion is also half of a kav, and that 1 loaf of a bread we're saying is Mazon Shtei Sudis, which means that half of a kav is 2 meals, which means that a whole kav is 4 meals. Got it? Good. That's the important part, really. That's what's going to be significant in the Gemara, which is that 1 kav, according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, will get you 4 meals. Now, whereas Reb Shimon Omer says, Reb Shimon Shtei Yadis Likikar Mishalosh Lekav, says Reb Shimon that it's talking about where you have 3 breads to 1 kav, and Shtei Sudis is 2/3 of 1 bread, which means that each bread has 3 sudis in it. You're having 2/3 of 1 bread, which is 2 meals, and there are 3 breads in a kav, which means that a kav consists of 9 meals, and you're taking 2 of those meals is the Eruv. So the difference between Rabbi Yochanan and Broka, just in terms of how many meals of in a kav, Rabbi Yochanan and Broka says 4 meals in a kav, Rabbi Shimon says 9 meals in a kav. Okay, fine, let's go weiter. Chetzia levayis amenuga. Now, 1/2 of a loaf of bread is the shir for bayis amenuga. We've already seen that a few times, that if a fellow walks into a house that has tsaras, so if he waits there enough time to eat half of a loaf of bread, right? K'dei achilas pras. A pras is half of a loaf of bread that's 4 eggs, and we said that that's the shir that we learn out from chita, right? From eretz chita usar gefen v'teina v'rimon eretz yeshem u'dvash. So we said that kol apazuk is that the shiur nemru is daf dalad Masechta Ayruvin, also came from Masechta Brachos. So we learn out from chita that it's talking about a loaf of bread that is wheat. But so half of a loaf of bread is what we're talking about for that shiur, that you're clothing after the amount of time that it takes to eat half of a loaf of bread. So then your clothing becomes tameh. So v'chatzi chetzi lefsolas agvia, and then half of that, i.e., a quarter of a loaf of bread. If you eat a quarter of a loaf of bread of tuma, well then you're going to be unable. You're going to become tamei, and you're not going to be able to eat truma. Meaning, in general, you don't become tamei by eating stuff, right? Ochel is not metame adam. The only exception being nivlas of tahor, I believe, is metame bebeis abliya. Akopanim. If you eat a quarter of a loaf of bread of tamei food, well then we're not going to want you eating truma. Says the Gemara, v'chama mazon shtei sudis. How much is enough food for 2 meals? Amar Rav Yudah Amar Rav Tarte Rifta Ikaryasa, 2 farmer breads. Rav Adabar Ahava Amar says Rav Adabar Ahava Tarte Rifta Nar Papisa, 2 breads of the river of Papisa. Amalei Rav Yosef Brei de Rabba, said Rav Yosef to Rav Yosef the son of Rabba, Avuch Kaman Svirle. So Rabba said to Rabba, Rav Yosef said to Rav Yosef Brei de Rabba, who did your father hold like? To which Rav Yosef Brei de Rabba said, Svirle Reb Meir, that he held like Reb Meir, we're talking about weekday meals as opposed to Shabbos meals. Reb Meir Svirle. So Ananami Reb Meir Svirle. So Rav Yosef says, yeah, okay, I'm also going to hold like Reb Meir, right? I also hold like Reb Meir. Because it doesn't make sense to say that the smaller shear, i.e. the shear that we're going to use for the Shtei Sudis of the Erev Tchumen, is the Shabbos meals, because Shabbos meals is always good food. And we say in the Gemara in Masechta Megillah, and Av Zayin and Beis, so we say Ravcha Livsima Shchiach, that there's always room for dessert. And because on Shabbos you have all sorts of delicious foods, well, you're always going to have room for delicious food, so mistama, you're eating more on Shabbos. And therefore it makes sense to say that you eat less during the week, and that's the Sudis that we're talking about for the Eruv Tchumen, for the Mazon Shtei Sudis. Rabbi Yochanan ben Breka Omer, Tana ukrovim deverim lios shaven. Now we learn in a brisa that Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka's shiur is very similar to Rabbi Shimon's shiur. Now, that is why it's important that you understood the 4 meals in a kav versus 9 meals in a kav. No, it's less important that you get all the math there, but what is important is to know that according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, 1 kav has 4 meals, whereas according to Rabbi Shimon, 1 kav has 9 meals. So now the Gemara says, Tana ukrovim devrem lios shavim. They're very close the sizes are very close, right? So midami, to which the Gemara says, how does that make any sense? The Rabbi Yochanan arba sudasa likava, the Rabbi Shimon teisha sudasa likava. According to Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, there's 4 sudis in 1 kav, whereas according to Rabbi Shimon, there are 9 sudis in a kav. That's a difference of more than double. So what does it mean that they're similar? So Amar Rav Chizda says, Rav Chizda tzemein shlish lechenvani. So Rav Chizda says, well, Rav Chizda says you have to take into account the markup of the store owner, of the baker, right? He's got to make some money. So therefore, even though so we said that 1 pundion will get you a half a kav, and that was 2 meals. So basically, even though in half a kav there are 2 meals, but there's actually a markup. The truth is that in half a kav there's really 3 meals, which means that in a whole kav there's actually 6 meals. In a whole kav there are 6 meals, just that the Chenvani is only selling you 2 meals so that he can make a profit. Fine. But that doesn't help that much because it gets us closer, right? So in 1 kav, according to Rabbi Yochanan, there are 6 meals, but according to Rabbi Shimon, there are 9 meals. That's still a pretty big difference, a 50% difference. So Ela ki'idach to Rav Chizda. Rather, you have to rely on the other opinion of Rav Chizda, the Amar tzemein mechza l'chenvani. So you have to take out 50%, it's a 50% markup. So the truth is that in half a kav there are actually 4 meals, which means that in a whole kav there are 8 meals, and he's only selling the guy 2 meals, so he can make a 50% markup. So, or really 100% markup. So there you go. So according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, there are 8 meals in a kav. According to Rabbi Shimon, there are 9 meals in a kav. But still, according to one it's 8, according to one it's 9. So yeah, exactly. That he didn't say that. The Brisa doesn't say that they're equal. It says that they're close to being equul. So kasha Rav Chizda to Rav Chizda. So the Gemara says that, but nonetheless, it's still kasha and Rav Chizda upon himself. In one place, he says there's a markup of right that he's selling you 2, when really there are 3 in a kav. The other one says he's telling you 2 when there are really 4 in a kav. So is it 3 or is it 4? So, or really in half of a kav. So, lo kasha, it's no problem. It depends if the balabais, if the guy who's coming to buy, I think it's talking about the guy who's coming to buy the guy who's coming to buy the bread, if he brings his own wood for the fire, well then the chenvani will have, the baker will have less of a markup. But if he doesn't bring his own wood, well then it's going to be a higher markup. That's all. That's all. Chevra, that's all for Daf Pei Beis of Masechta Ayruvin. So let's go over some of this interesting stuff that we learned. So we talked about the nafkamina between gambling. So we had the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda that only a full-time gambler is not allowed to testify, because according to him, the issue is not about theft. The issue is that he's not in line, in touch. A full-time gambler is not in touch with the way of the world. He's just interested in quick hacks. So therefore he can't testify. According to Rabbi Yehuda, in the name of Rabbi Tarfon, he says any gambler is unable to be a witness because they're thieves. They're stealing. We talked about including a child in the mother's ayruv. Rav Asi says that even a child who's 6 years old can be by default included in the mother's ayruv. Rabbi Shua Breder of Edi says only a child until 5 years old. At 5 years old already, the parents, the mother, would have to explicitly include the child in the ayruv. Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yanai say that if the father is around, well then only until 4. If the father is not around, well then even a child of 6 can be included in the ayruv. We then talked about people who are included by default in the ayruv of the master of the house and who is not. Children and non-Jewish slaves are by default included in the ayruv of the household being done by the man of the house, whereas his wife, his older children, his Jewish servants are not. It's up to them if they want to. If by default they're included, if they don't say anything, they're included. But otherwise. If they don't say anything, then they're included. But if they make their own ayruv, or if they say they don't want to be included, so they're not included. Fine. And then we talked about what is the shear of the ayruv. So we said it's mazon shtei sudas. That's the shear. And then we got into machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka and Rabbi Shimon about is there 4 meals in a kav or 9 meals in a kav. And we ended up saying it's really 8 meals in a kav if you figure out based on, if you take into account the markup of the baker. Chevra, peace out.